Welcome everyone to the fifth day of our summer seminar on the classical liberal tradition. I'm James Buchanan with the Institute for Humane Studies, and we are honored to be joined today by Bobbi Herzberg. Dr. Herzberg is a distinguished senior fellow for the F.A. Hayek Program in Advanced Study in Philosophy, Politics, and Economics, and a senior research fellow at the Mercatus Center. She is emerita faculty in the Political Science Department at Utah State University, where she has served as department head and administrative director of the Institute of Political Economy. Dr. Herzberg has also served as the president of the Public Choice Society, which is a good fit for today's lecture, and as a director at the Templeton Foundation. She writes and speaks regularly on public policy, and I should note here that she has practical experience working on policy in Utah, public choice, institutional analysis, and the Bloomington School. And the title of her lecture today is Politics Without Romance. Dr. Herzberg?
Well, thank you, Jason. I appreciate it, and I appreciate the opportunity to come and speak about a subject I care deeply about, and that is public choice theory. I started way too many years ago in the area of public choice, trained at Washington University in St. Louis, under the committee of Ken Shepsley, who's now at Harvard, Randy Calvert, who is been at Rochester and then at Washington University in St. Louis, and then Barry Weingast, who of course is at Stanford University. And so my roots in this area, I go back quite a ways, too far for since these guys have been long gone from that place. It's obvious how long I've been in this. But I want to talk today about public choice. And James Buchanan referred to that as politics without romance. And I hope to give you a sense of what he meant by politics without romance, why public choice would sort of try and take a little bit of that edge, a little bit of the shine off of our hope that politics can solve all ills in the economy and in society at large. And I think that that's really what has been the greatest contribution of public choice theory. And while this all seems, and the things that we'll talk about in public choice theory all are pretty obvious today as we think about problems and we question and have concerns about the way in which politicians and policymakers make their policies and laws for us in the public sector. At the time that James Buchanan and Gordon Tullock and others at the beginning of the public choice movement started this enterprise, it was not as obvious. Many people believed that, in fact, if you were having problems either in society or in the economy, that a failure of that sort, a market failure, required that you have a government type solution. And this was the era of that. And so we want to talk a little bit about how what is now obvious to most of us who look at these kinds of problems could have been such a large contribution at the time. And so what did they do when they initiated public choice theory back in the 1960s and even into the late 1950s? Well, what public choice theory does is it applies the assumption of economics and the tools of economics to political and social decision making. And as I say, it's politics without romance in the sense that instead of assuming that such decisions are always made only in reference to a common or public good, it recognizes that the same humans that populate society more broadly in social institutions, civil institutions, and the economy are the same humans that also populate the government. So if they are flawed in their business practices, they will likely be equally flawed when they are making decisions in the public arena. And then in addition, we have a number of other problems or challenges that emerge as we move from the private sector into the public sector. And one of those is we move from individual level types of decisions privately on our own, perhaps within families, perhaps, within smaller social groups, but groups that we've largely agreed to be bound by, to now much larger groups where now we have to work these things out socially. And so that extra difficulty of how to make social choices out of those individual preferences and interests to serve the public that those choices are being made for is a often much more challenging task than many of those who were arguing for moving many of these decisions into government, especially under the move to sort of socialist and controlled economies, command economies during this period. So this is, again, in response, not unlike the way that others this week have talked about the Austrian. And so that's what public choice theory is in part a response to, trying to see if we can get a handle on how could we make better government choices? How can we use what we know about the challenges in the private sector to also understand what can be done? Now, one of the features of public choice that emerges out of this, and we see it in the work, for example, by Dick Wagner, also at George Mason University in economics, is he characterizes this area as entangled systems, entangled decision-making, and notes that often the economic and political and social decisions get entangled in such a network that it is often really difficult for us to separate out and attribute the consequence to one area or another. So today I want to talk very briefly, and it's very brief, we're talking 50 years plus of work on public choice, and there's no way I can even touch. But what I want to do is give you a little bit of a feel for it and how it breaks down. Now, the Virginia, Rochester, and Bloomington schools are the way in which Bill Mitchell of University of Oregon, he's since passed away, wrote about public choice in its initial formation. So he saw three distinct schools. The Virginia school, started by Buchanan and Tulloch, and is carried on in the tradition at George Mason University, with many, many fine scholars today operating out of that in a long tradition. The Rochester school, which this is Bill Riker here, started with the idea of working on social choice issues, decisions of voting, decisions of elections, legislative behavior, and all forms of sort of political activity and political participation. And then the Bloomington School, which started with Vincent and Eleanor Ostrom in an effort to try and look at a number of institutional rules and to get a more complex thinking about some of the problems that were there. So we're going to start a little bit about the major contributions of each of these schools. In the Virginia school, I characterize three major, and of course, lots of scholars, lots of different questions they take up over the years, but I think many of them can be categorized into these three major areas. One is the area of constitutional choice processes. So calculus of consent is sort of the first major contribution in this area by Buchanan and Tulloch. And it is a book that tried to look at the notion that if in fact you wanted to design constitutions, the rules we would use for making all future social decisions, then you had to trade off some of the different types of risks that you would absorb from that, or costs that you would. So if you turn over your decisions to a state and say, I will be governed by the state, or I will be governed by this entity, that in turning it over, you hope to gain something in terms of the decisions that are reached and what you can do publicly and socially. You work together on things. And so you want to bind other people and you bind yourself as well. But in making that trade-off, you also give up certain protections for your individual interests whenever they are not in line with society and the social group that are making them. And so for Buchanan and Tulloch, they wanted to look at, well, if that's what we want to do, how do we design a system that provides sufficient protection of those individual interests, but also is capable of acting when we need to act socially for the benefit of those within that society. And that is the challenge of constitutional choice. So they looked at a variety of rules, everything ranging from, under the most difficult circumstances, we might want to go to a unanimity rule. So one of the areas we see where we use unanimity rule is the area of juries, for example, where in that circumstance, because of the consequence of the decision that is reached, we want society to be sure that they are reaching the correct decision. So we put an extraordinary burden on them to find agreement. And then areas like constitutional amendments, changes to the Constitution, frequently have a more extraordinary requirement of agreement in order to move forward, because we think the consequence of, in terms of those costs that are possibly imposed on people, are greater by a major constitutional change. And so in those circumstances, that's the way we would trade it off, all the way down to sort of a simple majority rule where we need to get some things done. You know, we're gonna make lots of these kinds of decisions, and we think simple majority rule is the way to get the consensus of, well, what direction should we be going? And if that's not the right decision, well, it won't require much for another majority to come in and change that decision. So at that level, we have the greatest ease in terms of the decision-making costs and the difficulty of making the decision, but we also have the least protection, because a large minority, 49 point whatever percent, can be made worse off by the actions of the majority in that case. And so that is the logic that they brought to these constitutional choice processes. But in doing that, they mostly made us think about what is it we were really doing when we moved into the constitutional arena. Second type is bureaucratic maximization, and there's a lot of literature in this area as well. Again, by looking at politics without romance, instead of suggesting the bureaucrats would make the best decisions for us, they were the experts, they would only keep our interests in mind, they could look at issues of, well, are the interests of the bureaucrat the same as the interests of the public interest? And frequently in these studies, we found, no, in fact, they're not. Often the most interested players go into these areas. And so their interests, while in line with the area of action, may not be in line with the breadth of priorities or preferences of the public at large. And so in looking at bureaucrats from this different perspective, we could see, well, maybe it's more important for the bureaucrat to have additional power, to have additional control, to have additional budget, to make their jobs easier than it is for them to serve something in order of the public good. So again, it takes those ideas of economic preferences, places them on the political arena, and all of a sudden we get a very different interpretation of what we might expect. And that leads sort of to the last major, and again, many, many major ones. I'm going to focus on these three. Rent seeking and corruption. And again, much of this work comes out of Gordon Tulloch's work. But again, it takes this more jaded view of what, in fact, people who are operating in the social arena are operating upon. Are they acting for their own interests, or are they acting for this broader public interest that we might think is out there in some sort of ideal that we have in our heads? But in reality, we have real humans making real decisions, and they may seek to have government act on their behalf. And this is not a new issue with public choice, of course. It goes back, certainly we can see it in Adam Smith, and I know you've looked a bit at Adam Smith this week as well. In Adam Smith's work, he was very concerned with the sort of mercantile system and the preferences given to one business over another. And what the Virginia School leads us to think about and to work on is, what is it that's really happening in those settings, and are they able to take us to another level? Second school I want to talk about is the Rochester School. And you guys getting this at the speediest of treatments. I always feel like I do too little in trying to represent this. The Rochester School, in some regards, in terms of their major contributions, the Rochester School and the all three schools sort of start at the same time: Buchanan, Tulloch, Rochester, and the Bloomington School. But as Bill Mitchell suggests, they go off in somewhat different directions in terms of their methodology, their focus, and their impact. And the Rochester School is the one that probably more people have read about in their academic career, in large part because many who operated or worked in this school of public choice ended up being quite prominent in political science departments. So rather than being in economics departments, they ended up moving into and having greater impact in terms of political science and helping to understand and use that methodology to understand political problems. It tended to be more methodologically driven than either the Virginia School or the Bloomington School. All three of these schools have great empirical work and empirical contributions, but the Rochester School operated with more in the area of individual decision-making, social choice theory, and legislative decision-making. And so there's a focus often on legislatures, on voting processes, and we see the work of many coming out of this area. Downs as an early on representative, Riker, as I said, Shepsley, and many, many others in terms of using that type of organization. And so they're looking at Arrow's impossibility theorem was the idea that we could not make social choices under very many conditions, even if we had rational individuals who had well-formed and well-understood preferences. The transfer from that individual level to the social level would lead to much greater chaos. Now, it's impossible to have a decision that meets these nice, clean, decisive conditions. That was Arrow's major contribution. And there were literally thousands and thousands of papers that tried to look at, well, under what conditions could you do it? How far could you push these kinds of conditions? And does that mean we can't have democracy? Because that's what many interpreted it to mean. Now, I was trained in this school, and I can tell you that's not really what the major contribution is, I don't think. I think what the contribution is, it's not in that majority rule process itself that decisions are directed, that rather it is in much more complex institutions and mixes of decision rules that the decisions actually emerge. So if in fact majority rule will not necessarily give you a definitive outcome, could an set of agenda rules determine a stable and definitive outcome? Could different institutional power arrangements give it? Different rules about ordering of jurisdictions or access to the decision process at different points, give you that. And so what this led many in the field to push towards is to look for what are the conditions that help us explain the kinds of social choices we get, rather than focusing just on chaos. Because we looked around and people were reaching decisions. Congress was passing legislation. We were having decisions made left and right. Why would they be occurring if, in fact, Arrow's impossibility theorem was correct? Well, it was because it didn't say decisions wouldn't be reached. It said that the decisions would not cleanly reflect those individual preferences in this simple majority kind of logic. Something else would be happening there. So we see a number of studies in this area. We see voting studies. We see studies about committee systems. We see studies about different areas and jurisdictions and how that would impact different preference orderings and so on that come out of it. And they've had huge impact, as I say, in political science. One of the things, though, that challenged this particular school was the fact that it was highly mathematical. And as a result, it often had more limited impact in terms of the public more generally, and those who were not specifically trained in the methodology. And so its impact would often be only to the extent that it would create this logic that people started talking about, and then they would have to move to actually thinking about it with examples, with very specialized kinds of conditions and so on, rather than to be able to drive it to its fully generalized position in terms of the public at large. And so that, I think, made it more limited in terms of policy making and in terms of the public seeing the benefit of it. And then the final school I want to talk about is the Bloomington School and its major contributions. And here we have the work of, as I said, Vincent and Eleanor Ostrom, who were in Bloomington, Indiana, and I spent 10 years in Indiana at Indiana University as their colleagues, so I'm very familiar with this one. So I was trained initially in the sort of Rochester school, but I moved in my first job to Bloomington and worked with the Ostroms. And so as a result of that, I thought I was sort of going in the same tradition, but I started to see the nuances and differences that emerged out of it. So they used methodologies not unlike those that were used in the Rochester or the Virginia school, but they took them in a way that had a complexity that they wanted to retain in it. So their bottom line was institutions matter, the circumstances matter. So as you move to these simplifying models that public choice sometimes directed us to, you needed to retain the idea that if there is a rule in there, you can't just assume it away and think you're going to get a decision that is consistent with what your theory is telling you you should get, or with empirical reality. There's going to be a disconnect between the two, that you need to have the models be a more accurate reflection of the empirical reality you want to explain. And so with that in mind, they set about to do this sort of merging of rich empirical work, especially driven by Eleanor Ostrom in the early days in terms of the police studies, and the studies of polycentricity and metropolitan service delivery. So we see them do huge studies on police work, on education, on other garbage services, roads, etc., various areas. But we also then see them operating at a fairly high, sophisticated level in terms of constitutional choice and constitutional construction at the same time. So we see them moving in both of these territories. This desire to have institutions really reflect the area led Lynn to start working on common pool resources to narrow down to a particular type of problem and type of institution. And even though it was lots of different institutions around the world that operated under common pool resource logic, by looking at a variety of those within this one area, she could start to get real purchase on what were the critical factors, what were the design principles that if we could hammer them down, we would be able to start talking with meaning about the decisions that are coming out and which type of institution will succeed and which ones are likely to fail. And so in doing that, we start to see them moving towards complicating and enriching those models so that they weren't going to be able to explain all voting. They weren't going to be able to explain all goods delivery type of situations, but they were going to be able to explain all of those problems that fell into this notion of we operate together within a common property setting. We are dependent on each other in that sense, so we need to work out a set of rules. So by focusing the attention to that area and then digging deep into the empirics of what real people making real decisions were able to generate, they could really, I think, tease out a lot of important factors to look at. Things like leadership and the way in which the boundary rules of a particular common pool resource were defined, and how strict they were in terms of who could access that good, and so on and so forth. And so I think that this was really their major contribution, was to retain much of the complexity in the logic and work to model from a perspective that was closer to real world settings that they wanted to explain. And I think this comes out of their tradition in public administration. So both of them are sort of trained in this arena of public administration, and Vincent Ostrom made huge contributions in identifying the crisis in public administration as racing to say experts would know the answer, suggesting that experts might not know the answer, and that we needed to be much more sort of wary of relying too heavily on experts. Now, this past period where we've been dealing with COVID and all of the different decisions that are coming out of Washington and each of the state capitals, and impacting everyone's life in the United States in very fundamental ways, is, I think, an area where Vincent Ostrom's and Lynn Ostrom's sort of modesty about what we can and cannot do, and wariness about what we can and cannot do, would be very, very helpful. I wish we had politicians sometimes, and I don't want to opinionate here too much, but it would be nice if people recognized how challenging it is to actually put in place policies to serve the public interest, that truly serve the public interest. It's much more challenging because even knowing what that public interest is can be so difficult, and that's what I think public choice frequently tells us. So I have a number of lessons I want to take us through here. These are the lessons I hope the public takes away from public choice. And when I do public policy, I try and bring it down to nuts and bolts and examples and things, and trying to talk to my colleagues. And these are some of the things that I hope that they take away out of the very good, rich research and theory that has been developed over the years out of these three schools and others in public choice. The first is that the seen and the unseen, and that politics will always bias in favor of the seen. And so again, if we take the most recent examples coming out of the healthcare crisis, what we see is if we do this action, here is the life we saved, or here is we didn't have as many cases. What we may not see are all the other consequences. So one of the things you've heard of late is, for example, the rise in suicides, the rise in depression and anxiety that come from the isolation, the rise in domestic abuse that is going on. These are all consequences of a decision not intended to deal with those problems at all, but focused on an entirely different. But if you don't take into account that when you make this decision, it will have these kinds of spillover effects, then you can't always make the best decisions. That you need to look at as broad a perspective as possible. What markets frequently do, or private voluntary arrangements do in society, is they allow individuals to make those trade-offs and to make those weigh those differences between the costs and risks and benefits that they face. And so it doesn't require someone else to make it on our behalf. When you make it in the social arena, now we have that consequence that we find from the social choice problem. It's unclear whose preferences are what. It's unclear what we should do that is in the interest. It's unclear how we weigh the life of someone from COVID death versus the life of someone from a domestic abuse death. I mean, how do we weigh those different things? And then if you add economic consequences, social, other kinds of things, it gets to be so very, very difficult. But policymakers are frequently not in the arena to be able to look at that broad picture. They look at their own small arena of expertise. We hope politicians step back and look at that broader picture, but as we see, sometimes those politicians are not as well informed either. And so that's one that comes out of public choice. A second one that comes out is methodological individualism does not imply isolated individualism. That frequently the methods that are used in public choice theory are focused on the individual. And that leads people to say, well, yes, you don't care about the social. No, you have to care about whatever level is involved in people's, in the decisions that are emerging. The key is that there is no social impact. It is the impact on everyone within that social. So if we say we're going to decide how many deaths or the correct number of deaths, well, if you are in fact only looking in one arena and missing those others, then an individualistic perspective would say the individuals over here who are being harmed by that, involved in the decision, are going to bring information that is critical for the decision you're making over here. You can't just look, society will be harmed by these deaths over here. You also have to look down to every single individual that's going to be impacted by it. And that doesn't mean everybody is just acting alone, acting on their own behalf. We can bring our things together, but we also bring our interests together. We bring our action together. And that's the next one. Self-interest does not imply selfishness. That you could be the most altruistic human in the world and you are still well served by something that takes your interests into account, because they're going to take those altruistic interests into account when they're acting. And so self-interest frequently gets, cursed as selfishness, but clearly in this theory, there is no reason to presume that it has any selfishness involved. It is self-interested. It may be selfish, but it may be very socially minded if in fact that is your particular interest. And so the wider range that we look at that people can hold, if you presume everyone is a selfish beast, then you would design institutions of a certain form. Now, they may be those that are most protective of the public interest by doing that, but it would also be those that might leave a lot of possibility and a lot of positive social action on the table that we're not able to achieve because we've assumed everyone is going to act in their most sort of evil or base and narrow interests. And so by having it self-interest where self and those interests can be broader, we can really capture the full range of what matters to people, including the interests of others, the interests of the planet, the interests of lots of things that are out there. Incentives matter. I think if they take away nothing else from public choice, they need to understand that whether we want them to or not, people will respond to incentives. And if you design an institution in one way and you presume that politicians are only acting, as angels, and you design an institution based on angels, then those personalities will matter because you've now designed your institution not to take into account the full range of incentives and interests that can be out there. If, however, we say we've designed this, we recognize that people are going to respond to this range of incentives they may have, then we're more likely to build institutions that are strong enough and effective enough that they can hold up to those incentives. And so we should not be surprised if the consequences that we get don't mirror the kind of design that we're putting in place. So rather than focus on the individuals, focus on the institution. Another, models or simplifications, they are not simple. In a complex world, you're going to have lots of factors coming in. I think this is the real sort of test of the Ostrom's work and how challenging some of their design principles and some of their institutional structure, all the boxes that Lynn Ostrom includes and flow charts and all the rest of it. That's because life is complex and the problems, even a very simplified problem, is going to have lots of different factors. And so we should always keep in mind that whatever we've modeled, it's still a simplification of that reality. And it means that we need to always be sensitive to what we have not modeled in it and the assumptions that we have made, and keep ourselves, I think, cautious about how we over-interpret those models. And then institutions will emerge out of social interactions, that we do try to simplify these very complex things. We look for ways that we can organize them more effectively over time. We look for patterns where this worked out pretty well last time, maybe we should move to that next time, and so on. And then finally, for the public, my notion of the public interest, or yours, or any given policymaker, take whichever one you like or whichever one you hate, all of them, their interest is not the public interest. And the bottom line is there is no the public interest. There may be many public interests, but where we find ourselves on that. And so frequently when they'll say, we should do this because the public health people say we need to do this because it's in the public interest. Yes, it could be in the public interest, but it's in the public interest under these specific assumptions and conditions and so on and so forth. And the public is not a single entity in this way. And so public choice sensitizes us to that. And then at the end of the day, even with policymakers, even if we can get them to sort of understand some of that and be more cautious about it, there are still things that remain on the agenda for us coming out of public choice that would limit perhaps its impact, why it might not be taken up as much. The first is it can sound very pessimistic or very negative. It's easier for someone to say, I can bring you a solution that's going to address everybody's health insurance problems in the United States. And we hear this from politicians, I have a plan, I'm going to do this, and it's going to deal with it. and we elect them to deal with those things. But the reality is, it doesn't take away from the fact that dealing with those things is much harder than their promise of dealing with it. And it's much, much harder to govern and suggest the good policy reforms that we should have than it is to actually point out all the problems with them. And public choice has often been most effective at pointing out the problems, but that does not always work if, in fact, you want to have an impact in the public arena. So be sympathetic to the fact that sometimes action must be taken and we don't know the answers. And so try and help them design better institutions rather than the worst institutions. A second point, don't look at what people say they approve of or want or prefer or are going to do. Look at what actually happens, what they do, what their actions. And public choice is very much about looking at behaviors as an indicator of true preference over just simple statements that people make. And so it's easy to say you are in favor of solving the healthcare crisis. It's quite another to have your policies actually move us towards that. The challenge is when we make decisions in the social arena, it's very hard to hold particular people responsible for those. It's why we tend to focus on, like, the president. Because of the central nature of the presidency, we have a tendency to focus in there. But the president, even the most capable president in the world, may be ineffective at actually solving the sort of many complex problems that we face, or having the control that would be necessary to do that. And so everyone points at each other, they all pass the blame, and somehow we keep reelecting people over and over. The reality is, if we get down to things not about personalities, but more about the institutional arrangements and about what could work in this setting, then perhaps we would get closer to being able to have a real sense of responsibility and accountability to at least the institution, if not to the person. And finally, we can't eliminate interest. So at the end of the day, can we design institutions that recognize interest and help us better achieve our social goals? So we may always be doing institutional design at the margins, not at the center of this.
What role does historical analysis play in public choice theory?
Well, actually, it can be very helpful in public choice, in part because it allows us to take a longer time frame in trying to examine the question under examination, or the one we want to try and understand. That's especially important in institutional analysis because we tend to get caught up in the moment when we're looking at a policy problem or we're looking at a public choice problem. And as a result, we may be reinventing the wheel. This may have actually been tried before, etc. So any kind of historical understanding of how this operated in the past. And there have also been a number of quite good analyses of using public choice to try and understand things in the past, whether it's congressional voting circumstance using strategic behavior that went on to help account for why the Southern legislators would support a more liberal policy of race relations, well, perhaps to kill a bill. And so oftentimes historical circumstances provide more data and more distance that allow you to make your point without getting caught up in sort of people's interpretations of the time. So I think it can be very useful. Often it depends on how accurate, though, the historical analysis is and how detailed. If you're going to look at individuals and individual decision-making and individual preferences, then what do you look for in terms of historical treatments, we may not have the full register. It may just be a certain person's perspective. So if you go back to the Constitutional Convention, Madison's notes, a lot of people will use certain documents, but that's not everything, and it's always from the perspective of one person's accounting or another. And I think that's become even more of an issue today. But certainly there's a lot of it in there.
Can you talk about Elinor Ostrom's contributions to how we think about policing?
Yeah, I mean, I think that both the Ostroms did a lot on policing. First, Vincent Ostrom with his service delivery with TIBO models about people choosing different services, and then that became the sort of theoretical base that then the empirical analysis of actual policing in cities and the degree to which it served individuals, especially minorities, came out. That work got done in the late 60s and into the 70s in response to a movement at the time in public policy towards unigovernment. So in an effort to try and create greater equality, the argument was we would consolidate all the little burgs that existed in a metropolitan area into a big conglomerate and govern them in a more centralized fashion with more experts. What their work found was that even though now we had the same policies applied in all of these, anyone who had come from a largely African-American community that had had their own police services, their own schools, their own politics, now they had the same as the Indianapolis metropolitan area, but for that mother or that father in that community to try and act upon that required a much higher burden. Instead of going down the block or to the school to talk about things, you now had to go downtown. So that was the onus or the sort of initiation of the work. In policing, this became even more important. And the sort of debate we're having now about community policing and who do the police try to serve? Are they trying to serve the community for which they're supposedly working, is very reminiscent of the exact same debates they were having. And what they found was that people often felt like their services were better, even though by some sort of objective standard, the quality of their services were worse in their small community. They felt like they had more control over it. And so it's very much this notion of self-governance. And I think that's coming back very strongly now. And we're seeing the consequences of our efforts to try and create equality by this one-size-fits-all kind of logic.
For those who are interested in that question, I will refer you to Professor Jacob Levy's lecture earlier in the week on Black Liberty Matters, touching on several of these same themes. So we have several questions.
And I might also note that Professor Beck-Key and Lemke and Leah did a piece on updating Ostrom's policing studies and polycentricity as well. And if anyone wants the citation to that, I can give them that. So they've also worked on a very recent piece a few years back.
Great. We will link that on the website.
Thank you.
So we have several questions around what I might call the outlook of public choice, and whether it's maybe too dire, too pessimistic, too critical. So the first question is public choice anti-democratic? It seems like, you know, there are some who think that especially Jim Buchanan was anti-democratic in some troublesome ways. That was the thesis of a prominent recent book. What is the relationship between public choice and democracy generally?
Well, I think it focuses on the challenges that we have. But again, this is the politics without romance argument that I was trying to make. In the same way that Elinor Ostrom, in focusing on the police studies that we just talked about, she's noting and Buchanan's noting where they don't quite meet the objective of the fine idea that the policymaker had. If in fact they're not meeting that in reality, then even though in theory that's a more open, a more equal approach, in practice it will not be, because you did not get rid of all of the other factors that were coming in. You were trying to just isolate one, which may or may not have been the critical one. And so I think it looks pessimistic because it's saying this is not working. But in saying that's not working, what it also is saying is this gives us an opportunity to look for what would work better. And so always in all of their work, I think you see them trying to work towards how do we get self-governance? How do we get people who are actually trying to design these things for themselves so they could be a better reflection of what the people actually want, as opposed to someone at a distance saying, this is what the people should want. I would say they were far less elitist than most of the people running the strings of power today and trying to move towards consolidation, because they had actual confidence in the less well-educated poor people in this community doing it for themselves and not messing it all up. And to me, that's not pessimistic. That's optimistic. It's only pessimistic if you think the experts are right, that there is a single fine way that will serve all of us equally. Then I think it is pessimistic, because it does say you shouldn't do that. But I think we've got tons of empirical evidence to suggest that efforts to try and sort of short circuit the hard process of finding institutions that will work has not proved particularly successful.
So as a follow-on to that, is it fair to say then that in some ways public choice is a story about empowering localities and communities and individuals?
Yes, it definitely is. And we see that in the CPR work. If you look at the successful CPRs of Lynn Ostrom, if you look at Jim Buchanan's going down to smaller and smaller communities, federalism kinds of things. And even if you look in the voting studies, et cetera, if you go down, those that are most likely to work well are these smaller, more locally based, where in fact the relationship between preferences and actions is more tight. Information is better, the institutions are more familiar, and so on and so forth. So yeah, I think that is the story, and that's problematic. There is no question that if in fact the only way this works is if we're in our little tribes or in our little communities, then that is a problem for democratic types of systems. I think you see, especially in later work by Lynn Ostrom, for example, though, that she demonstrates how you could start to build these together. So there are parts that are very localized in terms of information gathering and preference kinds of considerations, but that you can take those in a polycentric or a federalist type way to build to much larger. And in fact, she even takes on whether or not global warming and international organizations can start to do this. She is cautious that there are problems in moving too swiftly to that high level and getting it right. But it's not to say you can't. It's just to, again, short circuit and go right to that and assume it's going to work out because that looks better from people's perspective, doesn't change the reality of what's happening all the way down. And again, that's the policing study example that we just talked about. It still wasn't working, even though it was intended for good things.
Sure. And I will just preview for everyone who's attending that we will have on Sunday, tomorrow, a lecture on polycentricity and current political issues. So
yeah, COVID polycentricity. Talk about a challenge.
I will commend that lecture to everyone. So we have time for one final question.
Okay.
if you had to describe the positive program for politics that might come from these public choice insights, how would you describe that positive political program?
Well, again, I think knowing where we have places we may stumble makes us much better at designing better institutions. So there's something very marginal in all of this that we work to improve, and we work to improve based on where we are. We take humans as given, we take them as fallible, and we work to then build those assumptions in trying to design better institutions and better policy outcomes. And when something doesn't quite work, we may have to go back and revisit it. And it is a constant process. So again, self-governance, sort of keeping it as close to people as possible and making decisions for themselves. That's the kind of thing where the disconnect between the policy outcomes that we're reaching and the preferences and interests of the people that are actually intending to be served is most likely to be met. So I think that that's the lesson. It tells us that's the positive. It's not that we won't have institutions. It's not that we won't have decisions being made. It's that those decisions should take real humans into account, real interests into account, and in doing so, they're likely to make much better decisions, much better institutions, much better policy, and be quick to make adjustments as needed, rather than to presume this is the correct policy and now we're stuck with it forever, regardless of the cost.